Hello and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is you're doing. For our free wire tutorial today, I'd like to share with you my Celtic inspired triple spiral design. Now it is absolutely inspired by the Triskelion, or the Triskele as you may know it, but it isn't a true Triskelion design. It's a little bit of a cheats variation. So if you'd like to join me down at the board, we'll take a look a little bit more closely at the design itself. So as you can see, it's not a true Triskelion. What I wanted to do was interpret the feel of the design in a way that's absolutely accessible to total beginners to wire work. So as I mentioned, it's not a true Triskelion, but it does have that kind of feel going on. So I've got a couple of samples on the board, and I'm going to be working in the heavier wire today, which is 1.25mm or 16 gauge. So if I just pop these up towards the top of the board, hopefully I won't send them flying. So I'm going to start first of all with approximately a 7-inch length of that 1.25mm gauge wire, which is equivalent to 16 gauge. And what we need to do to begin with is just get some warmth and heat into this length of wire. It's a bit chilly today in the UK, so my wire has taken on a rather firm temper. So we're just going to give that a little bit of a warm through to make sure that it starts out fluid and straight. And then we're going to attack it with those round nose pliers. Now I'm going to start a little bit of the way down the tines of my round nose pliers. I would normally start a spiral very close to the tip, but what I want to do is have quite an open central section. So I'm going to start that circular design with those round nose pliers. And what I want to do is make sure that the very end of the wire actually sits on the inside of the next circular form. So you can, if you need to, just give that a gentle squish, just coerce that to meet neatly. It won't sit completely flat unless you angle the cut on your wire. So what we're going to do now is start rotating around, but by leaving a gap, so that we're getting quite an open spiral. So what I'll do is go 2 times around on the one end. So we've travelled 1 time around, 2 times around, and before I go any further, I'm going to try and recreate that same dimension of spiral on the other end, but it needs to be in an S shape. So if one side is going over to the right, you need the other one to go away to the left, so it's 2 opposing spirals. So what I'm going to do is just grab a hold of the other end, try and recreate the size and dimension of that central aperture. You could put a mark on your pliers if you needed to. I tend to just kind of eyeball it and hope that it goes the way I want it to. So I've got the beginning of that circular form. Again, you can just touch that up slightly if you need to edit it to get the end to touch the inside of the next line of wire. So we're going to try and recreate as closely as possible what we see on one end, and recreate it to be as close as possible on the other end. So you'll see that I've gone a little bit wider on this side. Now if that happens to you and you need to tighten things up, what we can do is just draw those wires slightly more closely together. You can either try pulling those 2 wires closer by using the end of your pliers, or you can manually grip that circular form as it scooches around and just try and bring those 2 tracks side by side. So what I want to do now is use up all of the wire pretty much until we get 2 equal and opposite spirals on our segment of that heavy gauge wire. Now I will be honest with you, I did practice a couple of times in a lighter gauge wire first, just to make sure that I could get a definitive technique moving. So what I did then is translate it up to a slightly heavier gauge. If you wanted to wear this as jewellery, it would certainly benefit because it's quite open from being in a heavier gauge wire. And what I'm doing here is trying to keep the same distance between those wires as they circle around. And you might need to just spend a little bit more time than I'm going to getting that to be suitable for your needs. So we're looking for those 2 spirals to be of similar dimensions, and also to start and finish in a similar place. So you can see that looks reasonably balanced. There might be slightly more that I need to do on this side. I think I just need to take that ever so slightly smaller. You could draw a single spiral on a piece of paper and then trace it with both pieces of the wire. but what we're looking for in essence is a very fancy little S shape. I like to try and keep my videos as close to real time as possible. Obviously with some of the more complicated weaves that's not always achievable, but where possible I like to keep them as close to real time as possible. So if you need to just spend a few more minutes than I have getting that design refined, making sure that you're happy with how the piece looks and that you have some essence of equal and opposite symmetry, then please do just put me on pause, ignore me for a minute, and then we'll catch up in a second back down on the board to move on to the next stage of the tutorial. I have now again in 1.25mm or 16 gauge wire approximately 15-inch cut length, and what we're going to do is try to recreate one of those spirals as closely as we possibly can at one end. Do make sure that your ends are flush cut and ready to work, and again we'll just pop a little bit of warmth and heat into that wire to get it nice and fluid to begin with. So let's just pop our little S over to one side. Obviously I'm working with quite a long length of wire now. It's actually just stabbed me in the side. Don't worry, don't call 911, everything's fine. So I've got that loop going. That looks to be slightly larger than the other two, so I can just give that a tiny bit of a squish, or I can trim that off and start again if I really don't like it. So I'm going to start rotating around. Sorry about the noise of wire on the desk. When you're working with slightly longer lengths of wire, it can be a little bit tricky. So give that a tiny bit of a squish. Again, if you weren't happy, you could simply restart that design. So I'm going to just go by eye to begin with, and then I will offer my spiral up to my already created piece and see how closely they match up. So just moving around, and then I'm going to grab one of those pieces and see how we're doing. So we just try and line them up. We're actually not far off, so I'm going to continue going around and around. As I mentioned earlier, you can take a lot more time than I am. Just pause the video and then get that absolutely perfect. Again, you could use the same little piece of paper with a spiral drawn on it and copy from there, just to ensure that you have everything exactly how you want it to end up looking. So what we've done is we've recreated the spiral on one end. I can see I need to make it just a little bit smaller over the top here. And then what I want to do is continue just a little bit past that halfway point, that central point. So I just need a tiny amount of adjustment to try and get slightly more similarity between the pieces. So what I'm going to do now is offer this back over my spiral on that S shape, and you'll see that that's reasonably close. It's a little bit wide, so let's just tighten that up slightly. Tighten that up slightly, bring that around. If that technique doesn't work for you, you can manually adjust. And we've taken it past the halfway point, so let's just offer that up and just a little bit further around. What we need to do now is to create a circular form with this spiral top centre. So let's put the S shape down for now, and you could perhaps use a round block if you have one, and just continue to circle around the outside like so. I'm using a little form that I have from the good people at Beadalon. If you don't have one of these, you could use the bottom of a bottle, or you could simply eyeball it. You can use really whatever you have available. Now that's obviously a little bit on the large side for what we need, but it gives us an idea of how the final piece is going to look. So you'll see immediately which way up that S shape is going to sit in the design, and if it doesn't look right to you, play around with it until it does. What we're looking for is for the spirals to be moving in the same direction. So we're starting at this center point and moving around in a clockwise fashion. So starting here, moving around in a clockwise fashion, starting here, moving around in a clockwise fashion. And that is how we want those three spirals to interact with each other, all within that larger round form. Now the reason we add a little bit extra at the top of the third spiral is so that everything sits together a little bit more neatly. For the next stage of the tutorial, we need to start tying the spirals into the circular form and the spirals to one another, just to seal the deal, as it were. Now there are a couple of different types of wire that you can use for this. I'm working at the moment, my heavier gauge wire is 1.25mm or 16 gauge round raw copper. when you come to band those pieces of wire together, if you are newer to wire work, you may prefer to continue using round wire. My choice would be to use a 0.5mm or 24 gauge round wire in a complementary colour, but you have also the opportunity to experiment with banding up with some half round wire, and that's what I'm going to show you today. If you don't feel comfortable using a half round wire, then do just continue with the round wire and it's going to look beautiful. I have two examples on the board to show you, one with round wire and one that's been banded together with half round, so you can take your pick. So what we're going to start by doing, rather than trying to get the size of our circular form correct, we're going to start by banding the S-shaped double spiral to the single spiral up at the top of that form. Now I have in my hand some scrap offcuts, and this is 0.6mm or 22 gauge half round wire. Now I have some antique bronze colour, and if you struggle to see which way is up, it's just a second to see. One side looks soft and shiny, and the other side, when you twist it in the light, has definitive sharpness to it. So that's the round side, and that is the flat side. Now the flat side we use against our two sections, and what we're going to do is just bring them together one by one. So again, making sure that all of your spirals are moving in the same direction. What we're going to do is just pinch that into position. You could tape it if you wanted to. We're going to make sure that we start with the rounded side up and the flat side on top of the wire. And we're just going to hold that over the gap for a second and put a nice sharp fold over the top of the outside wire of the uppermost spiral. So I am going to put a little bit of warmth into this and just post the end. I am working with scrap lengths here of around about 3 or so inches. And what you want to take care with is making sure that the wire doesn't twist as you move. If you do feel more comfortable using a round wire where a little light twisting doesn't matter, then please do use that. In a moment I will show you examples using both types of wire. Now you'll see that I'm just pushing that half round wire through the lower of those two spirals, rewarming it again, it has quite a strong temper, and then pulling that up and over and then back through for the last time. Now this, if you're using a half round wire, can give you a really beautiful, almost machined look. It does tend to be quite strong as well. So what I'm going to do here is flip over to the rear of the design, and I'm going to trim those tails away reasonably close to the centre between those two spirals that we're bringing together. And I'm using the flush side of my semi-flush cutters. Let's put those scraps over to one side. And then what I want to do is to bring my pliers over the top of that little banded section. You may prefer to just push that into position with your fingers first of all. And because we've got some flex in our beautiful raw copper wire, I'm just going to allow my pliers to slip inside that design and squish down on that banded section. You may need to pinch that to keep it good and strong and true. And what we're looking to do is to make sure that it does look neat and tidy, and that all three passes of wire are the same kind of size. And it may take you a few seconds to get that neat and tidy, but you are more than welcome to go right on ahead and use round wire instead. So let's have a look at that from the front of the design. It does give a really attractive finish, and you can just move that around until it fits exactly how you want it to. So what we would do then is just repeat on this second side of the S-shaped spiral, attaching that to that singular upper spiral. So I'm going to continue to do that off camera, and I'll join you back in just a moment. If you find the prospect of working with half round wire a little daunting, or if you've given it a go and it just keeps on twisting on you, don't fret, pet. Just continue using your round wire. Now I would suggest a 0.5mm or 24 gauge, but rather than just 3 passes around both of those two sections together, I would suggest something like 5 or 7. Before we move on to the next stage of the tutorial, I'll show you what those two examples look like. So in my left hand I have a smaller section of the Triskele design, and this has been banded together with 0.5 or 24 gauge wire, and there are 7 rotations around each section where it is connected, including up at the top. So it doesn't really matter how many you use, but I would say 5 as a minimum. It still looks very attractive. I'm just teaching today with half round because it's something that I don't normally do. So let's have a look at the one that's been taught with half round. You can use fewer rotations to connect. It certainly is quite a strong design. And even if you accidentally flip that over onto the back, it doesn't look awful with the ends cut the way they are. It's quite a pleasant looking design, and it is certainly a great way to introduce yourself to working with half round if you haven't before. It's just little scrap lengths as well, you know, probably less than an inch each, to be perfectly honest. There's not very much going on there. So let's move on with the next part of today's tutorial. I've banded those 2 sides of the S-shaped spiral together with the one that's connected to the round form, and because I didn't have a round form that was the correct exact size, I used a wooden block that was larger. So what I want to do now is very, very carefully just start by making that circular form just a little smaller. And you can see that we're still managing to retain the circularness. I don't think that's a word, but never mind. What we're looking to do is to have both of the 2 sides of that S-shaped spiral touch against the outside of that circular frame. So just work slowly. Because you warmed the wire not terribly long ago, it still has enough flex just to move around. Now, when we started this design, we used a 15-inch length of that heavier gauge wire in the 1.25 or 16 gauge, which means that you have a really good long tail. In my example, I've just created a spiral up at the top, which I squished with my flat-facing bent chain nose pliers to give it some additional strength. However, I've accounted for the fact that you might like to wear this as jewellery, and you may prefer to use this long length of wire that's residual to create something a little bit more to your own choice and design. So you could very, very simply turn up at the very, very top with this connected spiral, put a right angle bend just up here, and what you can do then is create your own design of bail. So that's what I'm going to do for this example. If you wanted to recreate this piece, you would just maybe trim a little bit of this wire away, start with a nice large aperture at the centre of your spiral, but instead of opening out and around, you would create a closed up link connection. So you would keep those sections of wire touching one another to create that kind of nice solid, and it's very in keeping with the design. You can still wear that as jewellery or hang it as decor. But because you've got plenty of wire to play with, you can actually make that into a bail if you prefer. So that's what I'm going to do today. But before I start doing that, what I need to do is just create solid connections between the 2 sides of the S-shaped double spiral and up here at the top of the design. So it's exactly the same technique as I showed you, using whichever choice of wire you went for, just to attach at the points where they naturally touch each other. Do try and keep that roundness in the wire form. It just goes very, very well with the spirals. So I'm going to complete that off camera now and join you in a second to show you how I'm going to create a very, very simple bail up at the top. So I've just banded my wires together at the relevant points, just to make sure that everything is sitting as it ought to, and I'm just going to make the world's simplest bail up at the top. I'm just going to create a bit of a wrapped loop. So I've got plenty of wire here if I wanted to do something fancy. I'm going to push the wire forwards in a right angle, and there's about a 1/4 inch gap just up at the top there. I'm going to now grab my bail making. These are 6-stage bail makers. I can say words sometimes. And I'm just going to create a large round form up at the top, which would simply be able to go on almost any chain that you could imagine, or any threading material you wanted to hang it from, really. So I'm going to give that a tiny bit of a squish. Although we are working with a nice hard wire, it should be good and solid. And I'm just going to rotate the wire around the core. Now what you can do if you wanted to continue the spiral design is, instead of utilising all of that tail of wire going all the way down to the bottom and then simply having a very, very neat finish, you could add a small spiral at the top there, or you could see how much wire you have left over. So let's go down to the bottom. I think I can probably get another rotation of wire on that core, making a nice strong finish. So you could take this tail of wire to the back of the design and trim it away neatly, or you could add a bit of a spiral up at the top if you wanted to. Absolutely up to you. I think I'm going to go for clean lines today, so if you wanted a spiral, you could just trim that slightly, add yourself a spiral of your choice and sit it over the neck of the design just here. But what I'm going to do is bring that tail around the back of the design and just trim away with the flush side of those semi-flush cutters. And then we're just going to make sure that that last little bit gets neatly pushed away just at the back so it doesn't scratch the skin or catch on anything. And then you just need to straighten that up a little bit. Let's get that good and straight. You need to play around with the angles to make sure it sits exactly how you want it to. And there you have your Triskele or your Triskelion presented as a pendant or as decor to hang on the wall or wherever you fancy, really. Thank you very much for hanging out with me today, creating our Celtic inspired triple spiral design. Totally inspired by a Triskelion, but not a true Triskelion or Triskele, however you prefer to think of it. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I hope to see you back here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel very soon. If you haven't already hit subscribe, do please hit subscribe. Press the little bell so you can get notifications. I tend to upload a wirework video every Sunday around about 4 o'clock British time. Take care, see you soon. Bye.